Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Did you know that a group of 800 Irish Americans invaded Canada in 1866 with the goal of taking it over so they could pressure Britain into granting Ireland's freedom? Well, this actually happened. This was the 1866 Fenian Raids, in which a group of Irish American Civil War veterans crossed the border on ship and actually won a few battles, no matter how implausible it seems. Today I'm talking with Christopher Klein, who's the author of the new book, When the Irish Invaded Canada, the incredible true story of the Civil War veterans who fought for Ireland's freedom. When the Fenian Raids happened, Ireland had been subjugated by Britain for over 700 years. And when the Great Hunger struck in the 1840s and many Irish starved, this planted the seeds of a revolution. Those who escaped famine and fled to America were inspired by revolutionary actions of the Civil War to fight for their own country's freedom. So a group, the Fenian Brotherhood, planned on how they could do this. First, they thought of going to Ireland and liberating it directly, but then they realized that would never work because they had no navy and they couldn't launch an amphibious assault. Then they thought, why not go to British Canada? It's right across the border. Interestingly enough, this group received a promise from President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward not to interfere in any military plans because America was still sore of some soft British support of the Confederacy during the Civil War. So the Fenian Brotherhood, which included a one-armed Civil War hero, an English spy posing as a French sympathizer, and an Irish revolutionary who faked his own death to escape capture, began to implement their plan to secure Ireland's freedom. Well, the plan didn't work, but it did plant the seeds for the Irish Republican Army in the 20th century, Irish liberation, and many other historical events that happened. My eyes were really open to a lot of things about history that I didn't know about in this discussion, so I hope you also enjoyed this discussion with Christopher Klein. Christopher, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Scott.
I'm interested in diving into this topic because this is a subject area I know almost nothing about. And I'm curious, for your inspiration in writing this book, what sparked it? Did you hear about the story and thought it'd be worth a book-length treatment? Or did you think that there was something in the historical record about how people perceive Ireland that you thought needed corrected or maybe elaborated on and you wanted to do it for that reason?
The last book I wrote was a biography of an Irish-American bare-knuckled boxer named John L. Sullivan, who was America's first sports superstar. And as I was doing the research on the book, in one of the fights that he was fighting against another Irish-American, and there's a mention that he was a veteran of the attack on Canada, which made me do an absolute double take of what is this? And I think, like a lot of good stories, it sort of starts with just that little footnote, that little historical footnote, and then you start to dig deeper into it, and that little string you start pulling, you find there's a whole bunch of yarn behind it. And it was something that I had not known much about either. And I found that there was this incredible story to be told from the perspective of the Irish Americans who were launching these attacks on Canada. And it's an historical event that's a lot better known in Canada. The books that have been written have mostly been from the Canadian perspective, but I thought this really was a story that needed to be told from the Irish-American point of view. And I think the other thing in terms of historical records, and I have Irish-American roots, and I sort of gravitate to stories that deal with the Irish experience in America. But I think there is a lot of a misperception among many Irish-Americans that when the Irish came to America, they were here to immediately fit in and assimilate into American culture. And I think this story tells us that that's not exactly true. The road to assimilation was a very rocky one, as it is, I think, for most immigrant groups, where even 20 years after the famine that struck Ireland, you have these Irish Americans who still think of themselves as Irish first and American second, and they're willing to employ violence to get their means by launching an attack on Canada in violation of American laws. So I think it just shines a spotlight and I think just maybe helps to deepen our understanding about the whole process of assimilation of the Irish into America.
That's an interesting point because it's very hard not to look at history from where we are today and project backwards and think that the Irish could somehow see ahead where they would be completely assimilated into American life. But not necessarily those people thought of it that way, and they could be more akin to the first or second generation immigrant communities in America today. But I'd like to see things from the perspective of these Irish Americans who launched the Fenian Raids. So this is, I guess, a tall order, but can you give me a brief overview of Irish history from maybe about 1300 up to 1866 that animated the perspective of these Irish Americans and how they understood their own history so that they'd want to launch these raids?
Sure. Well, the luck of the Irish wasn't really something to be coveted for about 7 centuries. So it's in the 12th century when the Irish start to come under the rule of their neighbors in England from their neighboring islands. So they have the misfortune of then eventually being in the backyard of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen up to that point. And for centuries, England struggled with what they would call the Irish problem. And of course, what the real Irish problem is that the Irish weren't English. And the English really tried to anglicize the Irish, and the Irish resisted. And England not only took away Ireland's land and transplanted a lot of Scots and other Protestants into Ireland starting in the late 1600s. So they not only took away their land, but they also took away their rights. And they had these restrictive penal laws that went into effect 1600s, 1700s, in that time frame, that really restricted the rights of Irish Catholics in terms of owning land, being able to vote. Irish Catholics weren't allowed to own horses that had any value of over 5 pounds. They couldn't have firearms. They were allowed a knife, but as long as that was attached to a chain so they wouldn't be able to use it against law enforcement. And even in death, they were banned from certain practices because priests were not allowed to conduct graveside ceremonies at burials. So there's just a lot of colonial oppression that's going on against the Irish, and the English are trying to take away their language, their land, their rights. And then in the 1800s, 1845 to be precise, is when the potato crop starts to fail. And the Irish think that the British are also trying to exterminate them as well, and nothing less than genocide. And the reason that the famine, the potato famine, is such an issue in Ireland, and the reason that the blight strikes Ireland much worse than other areas of the world, and the blight actually comes from the United States and travels across the ocean. But the reason it affects Ireland is because of the land structure that the British had imposed, where Irish Catholics cannot pass their land down to their next of kin if they were Irish Catholics, but if any of the sons had been Protestant, they would get the entire plot of land. So you found the Irish were forced to really farm on these small plots of land. Most of them were owned by absentee landlords who were back in Britain, and they subsisted on potatoes because that was the one crop that they could grow in abundance on these small plots of land. So when the famine strikes, when the blight strikes, it leads to this terrible famine, and what the Irish then would say genocide, because what they thought was an inadequate response by British officials, and at the same time, they're also allowing the export of wheat and oats and barley and other crops under armed guard. So they see that the British are taking food right out of their mouth, and they think that this is this is sort of that Irish problem again. This was the solution that the British had found to the Irish problem, was to kill them off, or force them to be so weakened that they would have to submit. So in the wake of the Great Hunger, is what the Irish would call it, you have 1 million that die, 2 million that flee the country, about 1 million of them come to North America. And I think in today's parlance, you would say that they were radicalized by this experience of not only 700 years of colonization, but then suffering and seeing all the traumatic events that occurred during the Great Hunger. So the Irish who come to America in the 1840s, 1850s are really scarred by that experience, and I think that helps to understand what becomes the motivation later on in the story.
Tell me about the connective tissue between those who come to America and then those who take part in the Fenian Raids. Are these Civil War vets first-generation immigrants themselves? Are they second-generation? What comes to my mind is the Martin Scorsese movie Gangs of New York, where he takes creative license and basically shows an Irish immigrant going straight off the boat to the recruiting lines to fight in the Civil War and has absolutely no idea what a Union or Confederate soldier is. So what did it look like going from stepping off a ship, arriving in America, and then being a part of these raids?
There's a time gap that's involved in here. And most of the Irish who participate, at least in the initial raids on Canada, are those who are the refugees who come from Ireland. There are some who are also born in America, just basically young boys, almost teenagers who are sort of heard the stories that their parents had told. But for the most part, they're the Irish who had endured the Great Hunger and then came to America. And the other thing that happens when they come to America, of course, is they encounter a lot of the discrimination that they had at home as well. So you find that the Irish have to deal with the rise of nativism and the know-nothings in the 1850s. And just as the Irish didn't assimilate into English culture, they sort of reacted the same way in the United States as well. They sort of acted like a snake that coils itself for its own protection. So they sort of keep to themselves in their small communities and try to survive. And when the Civil War comes along, there's a few motivations for the Irish to fight. One is that this is a way that they could prove their patriotism. For a lot of the Irish, it's a paycheck. They are still at the bottom of the economic ladder. And I think like most Americans, they didn't expect the war to last for 4 years when it had started out. For the Irish who lead the attack on Canada, for many of them, the Civil War they view as a training ground for the war that they really want to fight, and that's a revolution against the British back in Ireland. So this is really what motivates a lot of the Irish who launched the attack to serve in the Civil War, is to gain this tactical training, experience with weapons, and then their assumption is war will be done maybe 6 months or a year, and then they will be able to go back to Ireland and use that knowledge to cast off the British from Ireland. So, there's that time gap in between when they come to the country and launch the attacks, but I think it also just shows you that trauma that they had gone through, even from the passage of maybe 2 decades, 3,000 miles, it's still very raw to them, that they're still willing to undertake this military venture.
This brings us to the Fenian Brotherhood. Did this group become formed fully before the Civil War, and did they have these plans for an eventual assault on Britain, or is it something that solidified as the Civil War goes on? How does this group come together?
So the group that launched the attack on Canada gets its start with the Fenian Brotherhood, and that's founded in 1858, so before the Civil War. And the Fenian Brotherhood is a sister organization to another group that was formed in Ireland in 1858 called the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And these organizations were founded by veterans of the 1848 Young Ireland Uprising against the British, which was another failed revolution. And after the revolution, the leader of the Fenian Brotherhood, John O'Mahony, came to the United States in 1853. And the initial plan is that the Fenian Brotherhood in America is going to raise money and purchase the weapons that they're going to ship back to Ireland to arm the uprising and the manpower that's going to be supplied by the Irish. So that's the initial plan. And by the end of the Civil War, they have a membership of about 300,000. It's a very powerful organization. A lot of the Irish grab